The early hours of March 24th arrived with a heavy stillness over Peak Cavern. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp, cold air that settled into the stone walls of the cavern. The rescuers, their faces etched with exhaustion, stood quietly around the shaft where Neil Moss remained trapped. The relentless urgency of the past 36 hours had given way to a somber quiet, as if the cavern itself acknowledged the weight of the situation. The floodwaters that had forced the team to abandon their efforts earlier had receded, revealing the narrow tunnel's mouth once more. It was a cruel twist, the passage clear yet no less impassable for those who had tried and failed to reach Neil. The rescuers, so numerous and determined in the beginning, now seemed smaller in number, their collective energy drained by the sheer impossibility of the task. Eric Moss stood apart from the group, his gaze fixed on the dark opening of the shaft. He had been there through every agonizing moment, watching as each attempt to save his son fell short. His presence was a quiet testament to his enduring hope, though the grief in his eyes betrayed his understanding of what was to come. He had remained calm throughout the ordeal, a stoic figure among the chaos, but now his composure seemed to falter as the finality of the situation became clear. The rescuers gathered near the shaft, listening for any sign of life from below. For hours, they had heard Neil's faint breaths, the only proof that he was still holding on. But now, as they strained their ears against the silence, the cavern offered nothing. The absence of sound was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow their collective hope. One of the team members leaned closer to the opening, their expression unreadable as they listened intently. When they pulled back, their face was pale, and their silence spoke volumes. A doctor on site approached the group, his steps measured as he knelt near the shaft's edge. He listened closely, his ear tilted toward the darkness, before standing and addressing the rescuers. Though his words were quiet, they carried the weight of finality. Neil Moss was gone. The cavern had claimed him, his breaths extinguished by the unforgiving confines of the earth. The rescuers stood motionless, the reality of their failure settling over them like a heavy shroud. Eric Moss approached the group, his movements slow but deliberate. He listened as the doctor explained what had happened, though he needed no confirmation. He had known this moment was coming, even as he clung to the faint hope that his son might defy the odds. He stood silently, his expression unreadable, before turning to the rescuers and speaking softly. He thanked them for their efforts, his voice steady despite the enormity of his grief. The team, though devastated, began to shift their focus to the next steps. The rescue operation had become a recovery effort, though the risks of retrieving Neil's body were no less daunting than those they had faced in trying to save him. The narrowness of the shaft and the precarious nature of the rocks meant that any attempt to retrieve him could result in further danger to those involved. The decision weighed heavily on the group, their determination to honor Neil's memory tempered by the reality of the risks. Eric Moss stepped forward once more, his voice quiet but firm. He addressed the rescuers, asking them to halt their efforts and leave the shaft as it was. He did not want anyone else to risk their lives in the attempt to recover his son. The rescuers listened in silence, their respect for Eric's decision evident in their solemn expressions. Though it went against every instinct they had, they began to gather their equipment, preparing to leave the cavern. The final act was both simple and profound. Loose rocks from the cavern were brought to the shaft's opening, each one placed carefully to seal the narrow passage. The rescuers worked quietly, their movements deliberate as they created a tomb for Neil Moss within the very tunnel that had trapped him. The sound of the rocks settling into place echoed faintly through the cavern, a somber accompaniment to the end of their efforts. As the last stone was set, the rescuers stood together, their heads bowed in silent reflection. The tunnel, now filled, became a monument to Neil's courage and determination. It was a tragic ending to a journey that had begun with such hope and ambition, but it was also a reminder of the risks that come with the pursuit of the unknown. The cavern grew quiet once more as the rescuers packed their tools and began to leave. Eric Moss lingered, his gaze fixed on the sealed shaft. The weight of his loss was etched into his posture, though he remained composed. As he turned to follow the others, His steps were slow, his figure receding into the shadows of the cavern. In the years that followed, the tunnel where Neil Moss lost his life became known as Moss Chamber, a name that ensured his memory would endure. The story of his final expedition served as a reminder of the dangers of exploration, as well as the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. For those who had been there, the echoes of that day remained, a testament to the profound connection between man and the earth that both inspires and humbles. The air inside Peak Cavern was damp and cold, carrying with it a faint metallic smell that lingered in the stillness of the massive underground chamber. The cavern, nestled in the heart of northern England, had long been a source of intrigue and adventure. Over centuries, it had served as a shelter for rope makers, a hideout for criminals, and a place of legend for those daring enough to explore its winding depths. Its sheer scale and labyrinthine passages made it a natural draw for adventurers and spelunkers, each seeking to uncover its secrets. Neil Moss, a 20-year-old British college student, stood on the edge of a small, dark opening deep within the cavern. The light from his headlamp flickered against the rugged walls, casting fleeting shadows over the jagged edges of the tunnel. It was not the first time he had been here. For the past 2 weeks, he and his group of amateur explorers had marveled at the entrance to this mysterious, narrow passage. Despite the many twists and turns of Peak Cavern that had been charted by others, this particular tunnel was untouched. No one knew where it led or what lay beyond its narrow entrance. The allure of the unknown weighed heavily on Neil and his companions. The possibility that this tunnel could lead to a previously undiscovered chamber, one that might bear their name, was too tempting to ignore. Such discoveries were the stuff of legend among spelunkers. A chamber hidden deep beneath the earth could immortalize those who found it, granting them a small but significant place in history. But the risks were undeniable. The opening of the tunnel was barely 1.5 feet wide, its tight dimensions promising a treacherous journey for anyone who dared to enter. There was no guarantee of an open chamber or even a passage wide enough to continue. The tunnel might lead to a dead end or, worse, become a trap for the unwary. It was a gamble, one that required not only physical endurance but a steely resolve. Neil, tall and lean, seemed undeterred. His height, over 6 feet, was less than ideal for the task. Experienced cavers often favored smaller frames, which allowed them to navigate tight spaces more easily. Still, Neil was determined. He had the strength, intelligence, and courage needed to confront such challenges. More importantly, he had a deep-seated fascination with the dark, silent world beneath the surface. For Neil, cave exploration was more than a test of physical limits. It was a journey into the unknown, a chance to be alone with his thoughts in an environment few dared to enter. The group had deliberated for some time, weighing the risks and debating who should go first. There was no shortage of enthusiasm among them, but the hazards of the tunnel tempered their excitement. Each member understood that the one who ventured into the darkness would face unknown perils, sudden drops, loose rocks, and the ever-present risk of becoming stuck in the tight confines of the tunnel loomed large in their minds. In the end, Neil volunteered. He approached the opening with measured steps, his mind focused on the task ahead. The others busied themselves securing a wire ladder to a sturdy rock nearby, anchoring it carefully before letting it uncoil and fall into the depths of the tunnel. The ladder's end disappeared into the shadows, its full length unknown to those standing above. Neil adjusted his headlamp, the beam of light steady as it illuminated the narrow opening. He peered into the void, his eyes tracing the rough contours of the passage. He could see about 12 feet down before the tunnel curved out of sight, its path a mystery beyond that point. The unknown called to him, stirring a mix of excitement and trepidation. He crouched at the edge, swinging his legs over and testing the ladder's stability. Satisfied it would hold his weight, Neil took a deep breath and began his descent. The walls of the tunnel closed in almost immediately, the rough stone pressing against his back and shoulders as he carefully maneuvered downward. The ladder groaned faintly under his weight, a steady reminder of the fragile connection between him and the surface above. The deeper Neil went, the more the darkness seemed to envelop him. The cold stone pressed against his body, the air growing damper and more oppressive with every step. When he reached the bottom of the visible section, his feet felt solid ground. He paused, testing the surface with cautious movements before stepping off the ladder. The space was narrow, barely enough to allow him to turn his head. Using his feet, Neil nudged the coiled ladder further into the next section of the tunnel, hearing it unravel and slide down into the depths. It was a gradual decline this time, the ladder's movement suggesting a longer path ahead. He glanced back up toward his companions, offering a brief wave before lowering himself onto his stomach to continue. Neil's determination was unwavering. He understood the risks, but the possibility of discovery outweighed the fear that whispered at the edges of his mind. The tunnel seemed to close in tighter as he moved forward, the rough stones scraping against his clothing as he shimmied deeper into the earth. Every inch he progressed carried him further into the unknown, a place few had ever dared to explore. The cavern was quiet but for the hum of activity as the rescuers pressed on, their determination etched into their faces despite the growing weariness in their bodies. The hours of effort had stretched into the night, and the once steady rhythm of their work had become fragmented by frustration and exhaustion. Yet no one spoke of stopping. Neil Moss was still alive, deep within the unyielding tunnel, and as long as he breathed, there was hope. Above ground, the weather began to shift. Clouds gathered ominously, and the air carried the faint chill of approaching rain. The thought of water pouring into the cavern added a new layer of urgency to the rescue effort. Peak Cavern was known to flood during heavy rains, its natural channels directing water deep into its passages. For Neil, trapped in the lowest reaches of the narrow shaft, the threat of flooding was more than dangerous. It was potentially fatal. Below, Neil remained wedged tightly in the rock, his body refusing to yield to the tunnel's oppressive grip. His breaths were faint and shallow, the limited oxygen taking its toll. Each inhale felt like a battle against the weight of the earth pressing against him. The cold had seeped into his bones, dulling his senses and leaving his muscles stiff and unresponsive. He had drifted in and out of consciousness, his awareness fragmented and hazy. When he was awake, the darkness around him felt infinite, the silence broken only by the faint sounds of activity above. The rescuers made one final, desperate attempt to reach Neil. A smaller rescuer, chosen for their slight frame, was prepared to descend into the shaft with a specific task. They would attempt to physically manipulate Neil's body to create enough space for extraction. The plan was risky, and the team understood the stakes. The rescuer would have to navigate the same tight confines that had trapped Neil, facing the possibility of becoming stuck themselves. The descent began with a careful precision that masked the tension in the air. The rescuer moved slowly, each inch gained through a combination of skill and sheer will. Above, the team monitored their progress, their movements synchronized as they worked the ropes and pulleys. The floodlights cast long, sharp shadows across the cavern walls, illuminating the determined faces of those who had spent hours fighting to save Neil. The rescuer reached Neil, their body contorted to fit within the narrow shaft. They could see his form dimly, his body almost motionless but for the faint rise and fall of his chest. The air in the tunnel was heavy and damp, and the confined space amplified every sound. The rescuer attempted to position themselves to assess Neil's condition, but the tightness of the shaft made even the simplest movements a struggle. The plan to adjust Neil's body proved nearly impossible to execute. His position, compounded by the narrowness of the tunnel and the rigidity of his limbs, left little room for manipulation. The rescuer tried repeatedly, their efforts growing more desperate as time slipped away. The team above, sensing the difficulty, offered encouragement and advice, their voices strained but steady. After several agonizing minutes, it became clear that the plan was not working. The rescuer signaled to the team above, and they began the process of pulling them back to the surface. The team's faces were grim as they realized the implications. The methods they had relied on, the ingenuity, the tools, the calculated risks, had all failed to free Neil. The tunnel had become an unrelenting prison, its walls a reminder of nature's indifference to human effort. The first drops of rain began to fall as the rescuer emerged from the shaft, their body covered in dust and sweat. The cavern grew cooler as the storm outside intensified, the sound of rainfall echoing faintly through the passages. The team worked to cover the shaft, hoping to prevent water from seeping in, but their efforts felt small against the power of the elements. The knowledge that Neil remained trapped, so close yet impossibly far, weighed heavily on everyone present. As the rain continued, the rescuers gathered to reassess their options. Some advocated for another attempt, unwilling to abandon the effort despite the growing risks. Others pointed to the limitations of their tools and the deteriorating weather, emphasizing the danger of continued operations. The debate was quiet but tense, the voices of hope and pragmatism clashing in a shared grief. Eric Moss watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. The weight of the situation had settled on his shoulders, his presence a quiet testament to the bond between father and son. He had remained steadfast throughout the ordeal, his faith in the rescuers unshaken. Yet, as the rain poured and the minutes ticked by, the reality of Neil's predicament began to take hold. The cavern itself seemed to reflect the somber mood of the team. The light from the floodlights flickered as the wind picked up, casting eerie patterns on the walls. The rescuers worked silently to secure their equipment, their movements slower now, the hope that had driven them earlier replaced by a grim determination. They knew the odds were no longer in their favor, but they pressed on, unwilling to leave Neil behind without exhausting every possibility. The hours dragged on as the rescue operation continued, every moment a race against the diminishing supply of oxygen in the tunnel. Above ground, the rescuers worked with a feverish intensity, their faces etched with concentration and exhaustion. The cavern, once silent and still, had become a hive of activity, with tools clattering and ropes creaking as the team fought to free Neil from his subterranean prison. The stakes were clear to everyone involved. Failure was not an option, yet success seemed agonizingly out of reach. The air in the narrow shaft was growing thinner, its weight pressing heavily on Neil's chest. Deep below, his breaths were shallow and labored, each one a monumental effort against the oppressive atmosphere. His limbs were pinned, his body wedged tightly between the unyielding stone walls. The cold seeped into his muscles, turning every attempt at movement into an exhausting struggle. He could hear the faint sounds of activity above, a distant reminder that he was not alone, even as the silence of the tunnel seemed to envelop him. The rescuers had devised multiple strategies to reach Neil, each more desperate than the last. One team worked tirelessly to dislodge the rocks pinning the ladder, using long poles and tools lowered into the shaft. Another team attempted to send oxygen down the tunnel, rigging a makeshift system to pump fresh air into the confined space. The engineers and miners collaborated on refining their equipment, modifying existing tools and constructing new ones in a bid to gain even the slightest advantage. Despite their combined efforts, every attempt to reach Neil ended in failure. The tools often became snagged on the jagged walls of the tunnel, their progress halted by the unpredictable terrain. The ropes and cables, designed to support the weight of a person, struggled to navigate the sharp turns and tight spaces of the shaft. Each setback was met with renewed determination, but the clock was ticking, and the margin for error was growing thinner by the minute. Above ground, the atmosphere was tense. The rescuers moved with a grim urgency, their faces shadowed by the harsh floodlights illuminating the entrance to the cavern. The damp air carried the acrid scent of machinery, mingling with the earthy smell of the cave. Volunteers brought food and water to the exhausted team, though few had the appetite to eat. The only sounds were the clatter of tools, the hum of equipment, and the occasional shouted instructions as the team coordinated their efforts. Eric Moss, Neil's father, stood silently near the entrance, his presence a constant reminder of the human cost of the operation. His expression was stoic, but his eyes betrayed the depth of his worry. He watched as the rescuers worked tirelessly to free his son, his hope tempered by the harsh reality of the situation. Though he offered no words, his presence seemed to anchor the team, inspiring them to push through their fatigue and despair. The rescuers knew they were running out of options. The tight confines of the tunnel made it nearly impossible to send someone down to assist Neil directly. Those who attempted the descent found themselves trapped or forced to retreat, their efforts hampered by the same obstacles that held Neil captive. The risk of becoming stuck themselves loomed over every decision, a constant reminder of the fragility of their position. Neil's condition was deteriorating. The lack of oxygen was taking its toll, his breaths growing fainter and more irregular. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the darkness pressing in around him. The cold stone walls that had once been a source of excitement and challenge now felt like a tomb, their unyielding presence a cruel reminder of how far he was from freedom. Despite his fading strength, he clung to the faint hope that the rescuers would succeed. Above, the team attempted one final strategy. A small, agile rescuer was lowered into the shaft, equipped with a rope and specialized tools to navigate the tight space. The descent was slow and arduous, every movement calculated to avoid becoming trapped. As the rescuer neared Neil's position, the tension above reached its peak. The team watched in silence, their collective breath held as they waited for news. The rescuer reached Neil and managed to secure a rope around him, a small victory in an otherwise grueling operation. The team above began to pull, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Neil's body shifted slightly, but the resistance from the tight tunnel walls was immense. The pressure of the rope against his chest made breathing even more difficult, and the rescuers signaled for the team to stop. The risk of suffocation was too great, and the method was abandoned. As the rescuer was pulled back to the surface, the realization began to sink in. Despite their best efforts, Neil's situation was growing increasingly dire. The rescuers regrouped, their exhaustion evident in their slow movements and subdued expressions. Yet, even in the face of mounting challenges, they refused to give up. The operation continued, driven by the hope that they could still bring Neil back to the surface. Time, however, was no longer on their side. Above the tunnel, the air buzzed with urgency as Neil's companions scrambled to summon help. The realization that he was trapped deep within the earth spurred them into action, their voices overlapping in hurried discussions as they devised a plan. Within moments, a few members of the group left Peak Cavern to find assistance, navigating the winding paths back to the surface as quickly as possible. The weight of Neil's situation hung heavily over the remaining explorers, who stayed behind to monitor the trapped man and offer any support they could. The news of Neil's predicament spread rapidly, drawing an overwhelming response. Before long, over 200 people descended upon Peak Cavern, transforming the once quiet space into a bustling hub of activity. Among them were members of a mountain rescue team, experienced coal miners, and a handful of engineers, all armed with the tools and knowledge necessary for such a rescue. Civilians from the surrounding area arrived as well, eager to assist in any way they could. The collective effort was a testament to human solidarity, driven by the hope of saving Neil from his perilous situation. As the rescue operation began in earnest, the team worked tirelessly to assess the challenges of the narrow, unforgiving tunnel. The first order of business was to stabilize the ladder, which was still pinned by the rocks Neil had accidentally dislodged. Using ropes and pulleys, the rescuers attempted to shift the debris remotely, their efforts painstaking and precise. Each tug on the ladder was met with careful observation, the team above working methodically to avoid causing further complications. Meanwhile, the rescuers devised alternate methods to reach Neil. They lowered ropes into the tunnel, hoping he could secure himself and assist in his extraction. They attached oxygen tanks to long cords, carefully guiding them down the passage to provide him with fresh air. The damp, narrow tunnel amplified the difficulty of each task, as the rescuers struggled to navigate the labyrinthine cave system while maintaining communication with those at the surface. Despite the challenges, the rescuers remained resolute. Time, however, was their greatest enemy. The air within the tunnel was limited, and every passing moment increased the risk of oxygen deprivation for Neil. Above, the atmosphere was tense as the team coordinated their efforts, their movements driven by the grim understanding that failure was not an option. Far below, Neil clung to consciousness. The faint sounds of movement and activity above reached him intermittently, distorted by the layers of rock and the tight confines of the tunnel. He focused on these sounds, using them as a lifeline to maintain his composure. The heavy air made each breath an effort, and the cold stone pressing against his body sapped his strength. Yet he held on, trusting that the people above would find a way to free him. As the hours wore on, the rescuers faced setback after setback. The ropes they lowered often became tangled or snagged on the jagged walls of the tunnel. Efforts to dislodge the ladder were met with limited success, as the rocks pinning it in place proved more stubborn than anticipated. The narrowness of the passage made it nearly impossible to send a rescuer down without risking their own safety. The team debated the risks and benefits of each decision, balancing their desire to act quickly with the need to avoid compounding the danger. Above ground, engineers and miners worked together to design more sophisticated tools and techniques for the rescue. They constructed specialized rigs to lower equipment and individuals into the tunnel, modifying existing tools to suit the unique demands of the situation. Every adjustment required careful planning, as even the smallest mistake could jeopardize the entire operation. Despite their best efforts, the rescuers encountered new challenges at every turn. The limited visibility within the tunnel made it difficult to assess Neil's condition or the precise layout of the shaft. Communication was sporadic, as the thick layers of rock muffled sound and disrupted signals. The team relied on shouted messages and improvised gestures to relay information, their coordination strained by the harsh environment. As night fell, the cavern became an eerie scene of determination and desperation. Powerful floodlights illuminated the entrance, casting long shadows over the rescuers as they worked tirelessly to save Neil. The hum of machinery and the constant movement of people created a rhythm of urgency, each person driven by the shared goal of bringing him back to safety. The physical demands of the rescue took a toll on everyone involved. Exhaustion crept into their movements, their energy waning as the hours stretched into the night. Yet, the sight of Neil's father, Eric Moss, standing stoically near the edge of the operation, renewed their resolve. His presence was a silent reminder of what was at stake, and his unwavering hope inspired the team to push forward despite the mounting odds. Above all, the rescuers knew that Neil was still alive. The faint vibrations in the ladder and the occasional noises from below confirmed that he continued to fight, his will to survive mirroring their determination to save him. The collective effort of the rescue team reflected the best of human nature, a steadfast refusal to give up in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Together, they pressed on, their focus unshaken as they worked to bring Neil back from the depths. Neil pressed his body further into the narrow tunnel, his movements deliberate and measured. The walls seemed to grow tighter with every inch he descended, pressing against his shoulders, chest, and back. The confined space forced him to move in a controlled rhythm, pushing himself forward with his legs and using the tips of his boots to test the ladder beneath him. The cold stone scraped against his clothes, and the damp air clung to his skin, making each motion more laborious than the last. The light from Neil's headlamp barely illuminated the path ahead. Shadows danced on the jagged walls as his movements caused the beam to shift unpredictably. The air was heavy, carrying a faint earthy scent that seemed to intensify the further he went. His breathing echoed faintly in the cramped tunnel, a steady reminder of how far he was from the open space above. Neil reached the end of the next section and felt the ground beneath his boots. He paused, lying still to regain his composure and assess his surroundings. The ground here was uneven, littered with loose stones that shifted under the slightest movement. He braced himself against the walls, his body wedged so tightly that even slight adjustments were a struggle. With his toes, he nudged the ladder forward once more, sending it tumbling further into the unknown. The ladder's descent was met with silence, then the faint sound of it unraveling along a decline. The noise suggested a new stretch of tunnel, not a sheer drop. Neil's pulse quickened. His anticipation grew as he realized this path might lead somewhere significant. He pushed himself forward, inching his way along the narrow passage. As the tunnel continued, it became increasingly restrictive. The walls pressed against him, pinning his arms closer to his sides. He could no longer turn his head to look back or down, relying solely on the sensations beneath his feet and the dim glow of his headlamp to guide him. It was the kind of environment that could make even the most experienced explorer falter. The unyielding pressure of the stone was a constant reminder of how little control he had over his situation. Despite the challenges, Neil's resolve remained firm. The further he went, the more the silence around him deepened, amplifying the sound of his movements. His hands were pinned awkwardly, limiting his ability to adjust his position. Each motion required careful planning, a mental map of the tunnel forming in his mind as he progressed. The dark, the cold, and the dampness were elements he had come to accept as part of his passion for exploration. As he moved, Neil dislodged small stones from the walls and floor of the tunnel. The sound of the rocks tumbling into the depths ahead was unsettling. The echoes hinted at unknown expanses or sudden drops, neither of which he could see. He imagined the possibilities: a cavern waiting to be discovered or a ledge that could mark the end of his journey. Both thoughts spurred him on, his excitement tempered by the growing realization of how far he had come. The tunnel's incline shifted, forcing Neil to readjust his approach. The gradient became steeper, requiring more effort to maintain his grip on the ladder. His legs strained as he pushed himself downward, the walls scraping against his body with every movement. The tightness of the space demanded constant focus, a mental discipline that left no room for panic. Neil thrived on this challenge, the sheer physicality of it pushing him to his limits. He reached another ledge, his feet finding the edge with precision. The ladder dangled loosely beneath him, suggesting that the next section was a vertical drop. He shifted his position carefully, lowering himself onto the ladder and allowing his weight to test its hold. The space around him was suffocating, the walls no more than 18 inches apart. He began his descent, twisting his body slightly to navigate the tight vertical shaft. The corkscrew motion required to move downward was exhausting. Neil could feel the strain in his arms and legs as he forced his way deeper into the earth. Each twist and push was deliberate, a calculated effort to maintain control in an environment designed to challenge even the most seasoned spelunkers. The descent seemed endless, the tunnel pressing in on him from all sides. Finally, Neil's feet struck solid ground once more. He tested the surface, his boots sliding slightly on the loose stones beneath him. He straightened as much as the space allowed, his body wedged tightly into the shaft. The air was thicker here, the dampness more pronounced. He kicked at the ladder with his feet, sending it further into the unknown. The sound of it unraveling was shorter this time, suggesting that he was nearing the end of the tunnel. Neil felt a mix of relief and disappointment as his feet hit another solid barrier. The tunnel had reached a dead end. He stomped his boots against the surface to confirm it, the sound reverberating faintly around him. The realization settled in slowly. There was no chamber, no new discovery waiting at the end of this path. It was simply a cul-de-sac of stone, unyielding and final. Despite the anticlimax, Neil felt a measure of satisfaction. He had ventured where no one else had dared, navigating the uncharted depths of Peak Cavern. The effort had tested his body and mind in ways few could understand. With a deep breath, he prepared to begin the arduous climb back to the surface. The storm raged on as the rescue team worked tirelessly, their determination to save Neil Moss battling against the elements and the unyielding rock. The rainwater found its way into the cavern, trickling along the walls and pooling in low areas, a constant reminder of the looming threat of flooding. Above ground, the muddy terrain turned every step into a laborious effort, but no one complained. Their focus remained on the task at hand, even as the weight of the situation began to wear on them. Deep below, Neil's breaths had become sporadic, each one a faint, labored gasp. His body was still wedged tightly within the narrow confines of the tunnel, the cold stone pressing against him on all sides. The air was heavy and thin, offering little relief as he fought to stay conscious. The dim light of his headlamp barely illuminated the space around him, the once hopeful beam now a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness that surrounded him. His awareness flickered, the exhaustion and lack of oxygen dragging him closer to unconsciousness. The rescuers above decided to attempt one final drastic measure. A new rescuer, chosen for their small frame and agility, would be lowered into the shaft with specialized tools to try and dislodge the rocks pinning the ladder. If successful, the team hoped to use the ladder to guide Neil upward or at least create enough space to maneuver his body. It was a dangerous plan, but the alternatives were few and time was running out. The preparations for this last effort were meticulous. The rescuers secured the ropes and pulleys with painstaking care, ensuring that every knot and anchor was firm. The chosen rescuer donned protective gear, their face set with a mixture of determination and trepidation. The team around them moved with quiet efficiency, their years of experience coming to the forefront as they coordinated the descent. The rescuer entered the shaft slowly, their movements precise as they navigated the jagged walls. The narrow space forced them to twist and contort their body, each inch gained through sheer willpower. Above, the team monitored their progress, their voices subdued as they relayed updates and adjusted the ropes. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken fear that this might be their last chance. As the rescuer reached Neil's position, the enormity of the challenge became clear. The rocks pinning the ladder were deeply embedded, their weight and placement making them nearly immovable within the confined space. The rescuer worked methodically, using tools to chip away at the edges of the rocks and create small shifts in their position. Each movement was painstakingly slow, the limited space leaving little room for leverage or force. Above ground, the team listened intently, their eyes fixed on the ropes and pulleys as they awaited any sign of progress. The rain continued to fall, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the frantic activity below. The floodlights cast long, flickering shadows on the cavern walls, their glow barely penetrating the depths where Neil and the rescuer fought against time. Despite the rescuer's best efforts, the rocks remained stubbornly in place. The narrowness of the shaft and the weight of the debris made it impossible to create significant movement. After what felt like hours, the rescuer signaled to the team above, their frustration evident in the slow, deliberate gestures. The operation was failing, and the reality of Neil's predicament was beginning to set in. The team pulled the rescuer back to the surface, their movements slow and somber. As they emerged from the shaft, covered in dust and mud, the expressions on their faces mirrored the growing despair of the group. The rescuers regrouped, their voices hushed as they discussed their next steps. The options were dwindling, and the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. Neil's father, Eric Moss, stood silently near the edge of the operation, his presence a steadying force despite the hopelessness creeping into the air. His face was drawn and pale, his hands clasped tightly as he watched the rescuers work. He had remained calm throughout the ordeal, his faith in the team unwavering, but the toll of the situation was evident in the lines of his face. As the rain began to ease, the team made one final attempt to pump oxygen into the shaft, hoping to buy Neil more time. The equipment whirred to life, the sound echoing faintly in the cavern as the rescuers worked to maintain the fragile connection. Despite their efforts, the reality of the situation was undeniable. Neil's breaths were faint and irregular, his body barely responsive to the faint stimulation of the oxygen. The team began to prepare for the worst. The storm had passed, but the damage had been done. The cavern was damp and slick, the air heavy with the scent of wet stone and machinery. The rescuers moved more slowly now, their exhaustion evident in their hunched shoulders and dragging steps. They worked in silence, their thoughts heavy with the weight of the decisions yet to come. Deep below, the tunnel remained silent except for the faint echoes of the world above. Neil was still, his body a fragile presence within the unyielding rock. The narrow shaft that had once promised adventure and discovery had become a grim reminder of the risks of exploration. The rescuers stood at the edge, their faces lit by the flickering floodlights as they looked into the depths, knowing they had done all they could. Neil took a moment to steady himself at the bottom of the tunnel. The damp air pressed against his face, and the oppressive silence wrapped around him like a heavy blanket. The realization that the passage had ended in a dead end was both frustrating and a small relief. He was eager to escape the confining space and rejoin his team above. Turning his attention upward, he reached for the ladder, his fingers brushing the cold metal rungs. The tightness of the shaft immediately became a challenge. Neil's arms were pinned tightly against his sides by the unyielding rock walls, limiting his range of motion. He flexed his fingers, gripping the rungs, and tried to pull himself upward. The effort was futile. His body was so wedged into the space that even the simplest movement felt impossible. He exhaled sharply, trying to shift his weight and reposition himself, but the walls held him in place like a vice. Neil's legs were equally restricted. The narrowness of the tunnel left him unable to bend his knees or push off with any significant force. He tried to wiggle his feet to gain leverage, but the unrelenting pressure of the stone left him immobilized. For the first time, a flicker of unease crept into his mind. He had faced tight spots before during his cave explorations, but this felt different. The sheer inability to move his limbs made the situation more precarious than he had anticipated. Realizing that he would need assistance, Neil turned his focus to signaling his companions above. He gripped the ladder as firmly as he could and began to pull on it, the subtle movements intended to alert the group to his predicament. His heart raced as he struggled to make his actions noticeable. With the walls pressing against his chest, even breathing felt like an effort. The faint sound of movement above gave Neil a glimmer of hope. His team had likely noticed the tension in the ladder and would soon act to pull him free. He held on tightly, waiting for the first tug to indicate they were attempting to extract him. Moments later, he felt the ladder shift slightly, followed by a steady pull. Relief washed over him as he anticipated being hoisted upward and out of the suffocating tunnel. But something was wrong. Despite the evident force being applied from above, Neil's body didn't budge. He remained firmly wedged in place, the ladder unmoving beneath him. Confusion gave way to a sinking realization. When he had tested the ground earlier, stopping to confirm the dead end, he must have dislodged rocks that now trapped the base of the ladder. The weight of the debris pinned the ladder in place, preventing it from being pulled upward. Neil's pulse quickened as he assessed the situation. He attempted to move his legs, hoping to dislodge the rocks himself, but the confined space left him powerless. The ladder remained stuck, anchored by the very debris he had inadvertently created. Above him, the faint sounds of his team's efforts continued, their attempts to pull the ladder growing more forceful. Each unsuccessful tug made the reality of his situation clearer. The pressure of the stone walls became more suffocating as Neil's mind raced through possible solutions. He tried to shift his body sideways, hoping to create enough space to maneuver, but the tunnel allowed no room for adjustments. The rock pressed against his chest and back, compressing him further with every attempted movement. The cold metal of the ladder rungs dug into his hands, a reminder of how close help was yet how far away it felt. Neil called on his experience as a spelunker to maintain his composure. Panic would only make his situation worse. He focused on controlling his breathing, taking slow, deliberate inhales and exhales to conserve his energy and calm his racing thoughts. Despite his best efforts, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. The air in the tunnel felt thinner, each breath carrying the faint taste of damp stone and earth. As time stretched on, Neil became acutely aware of the isolation. The muffled sounds from above seemed distant, as if coming from another world. He strained his ears to catch any hint of conversation or movement, but the tight confines distorted everything, leaving him feeling disconnected from the surface. The silence below was broken only by the occasional shift of a rock or the faint creak of the ladder under tension. The realization that he was completely reliant on his team above began to sink in. Neil had always prided himself on his independence and resourcefulness, qualities that had served him well in his explorations. But now, trapped in this unyielding tomb of stone, those qualities felt insufficient. He needed their help to escape, and time was not on his side. Above, the group's efforts intensified. Neil could feel the ladder shudder as they tried to free it from the rocks. He clung to the rungs, silently willing their actions to succeed. The faint vibrations of their attempts traveled through the metal, a lifeline reminding him that he was not entirely alone. Yet the ladder remained stubbornly fixed in place, refusing to yield to their efforts. Neil's muscles ached from the strain of holding his position, His body pressed into the unrelenting stone. The cold seeped into his limbs, adding to his discomfort. He tried to focus on the rhythm of his breathing, using it as a means to steady his nerves. Despite the growing sense of helplessness, he clung to the hope that his team would find a way to free him. The thought of rejoining them above, of escaping the suffocating confines of the tunnel, kept him focused as he braced himself for what lay ahead.